When Belfast City Cemetery first opened its gates in 1899, its defining feature was invisible to the naked eye. Underground, a 9-foot wall had been built as a means to separate the Protestant and Catholic sections of the graveyard. Today, this subterranean divide remains, marked only by a slim grass strip that follows its path, and local residents still joke that it is only fair the two populations remain divided in death. The enduring presence of this unseen and historic line of physical division is emblematic of a more contemporary Belfast, where, despite the advent of the peace process in 1998, interface areas remain a common fixture throughout the city. These physical boundaries, also known as peace lines, refer to a wide range of physical barriers put in place between combative communities during the Troubles and thereafter. These structures have been woven so tightly throughout the everyday streets that at a certain point the city has simply begun to mould and shape itself around their existence. This has left many formerly connected residential areas carved apart and rendered the respective communities permanently divided. The cumulative research for my thesis began over a year ago when, after finding an interest in these conflict-formed residential areas, I wanted to further my understanding of these divided streets to a much deeper level than a simple analysis of their existing architecture. Influenced by the work of Irving Goffman on asylums, I explored the area of Townsend Street, located in the west of the city, just less than 1 mile from Belfast city centre, in an attempt to examine the ways in which the conflict architecture which remains can exist in a way which institutionalises a population or community by their means of social interaction, and how in turn these new configurations of post-conflict social interactions contribute towards reinforcing the sentiment of necessary division. The most jarring structure of conflict that still remains here is a 15-metre wide interface which severs the street in two, completely disconnecting the Falls and Shankill communities. This interface remains due to concerns over continuing conflict, despite the fact that the closest distance between the houses from each community is over 300 metres. At one point in time, Townsend Street existed as just that. It was the street which bookended the small town of Belfast, connecting the Falls and Shankill communities. Full of life, vibrance and industry, West Belfast as a whole was once rich in linen mills, foundries and many other branches of industrial production, all powered by the Farset River, the river which graced the city of Belfast with its name, the river which is still visible from Townsend Street today. Yet all of this rich history and heritage is widely unknown, as it is shrouded and often literally existing under the shadow of the post-conflict architecture which forms the Townsend Street we know today. A stark example of this overshadowing is still visible on Townsend Street today. On its land once sat the Soho Foundry, owned and ran by the McAdam brothers, a Presbyterian team who contributed to the creation and development of facilities within Belfast, such as the Linen Hall Library, the Botanic Gardens and Culturelane. One of the entrance pillars to the Soho Foundry still stands on Townsend Street as a listed piece of heritage, acknowledging the importance of preserving and celebrating the historical culture of our city, despite its turbulent chronicles. However, despite this recognition, a redevelopment and replacement of the existing interface upon Townsend Street occurred in July 2019, which resulted in the interface line moving a few feet towards the Shankill area, and so, as a result, this gate actually sits on top of and in front of the listed pillar, an upsetting metaphor for how centuries of Belfast's rich history will continue to be overshadowed by this short chapter of the Troubles era and its post-conflict architecture, if our ideas and practices of today do not change. I then took these ideas and discussions even further within my dissertation, influenced by the work of Michel Foucault on governmentality and history of the present. The discussion moved towards the genealogy of these areas and how, over 50 years after the Good Friday Agreement, which ended conflict throughout the city, something within these residential areas lingers on, resulting in the neighbourhoods becoming stagnant within their development. The causation for this fact is a culmination of unchanged practices, influenced social interaction, the utilisation of the population's subjectivity, and the conflict architecture left to create long-term scars within and between these communities. Through my research, I found that this is not a scenario which was isolated to the urban centre points of conflict within the city, but that the same level of segregation and evolution of division is occurring even in the suburban outskirts of the city. And this same fragmentation of neighbourhoods is occurring to the same level of intensity as it has within the inner city. This is where the focus shifts towards the area of study for this thesis, the village of Ligoniel. Situated in the northwest periphery of Belfast, at the foot of the Belfast Hills, is Ligoniel village. Its geological setting gives it the name Lag an Oil, the hollow of the lime, as it is snuggled into the limestone hollow of Wolf Hill. The name Wolf Hill originated through stories that the last wolf in Ireland was shot there by a farmer in 1692. The slopes of Wolf Hill were the focus of the linen industry throughout the 19th century, with a number of important works, such as the Mountain Spinning Mill, located along the Ligoniel and Crumlin Road. The concentration of linen manufacture in this area was largely due to the power and reliability of the flow of the Ligoniel River. Ligoniel was once a thriving industrial area, particularly important for linen manufacture, and the ruinous Wolf Hill Mill, along with the remnants of the adjacent Bleach Green and the two mill ponds, are the last survivors of the works at Wolf Hill. From its beginning, Ligoniel always held a very mixed community, where importance was placed on community support and pride. To begin my research into Ligoniel, I conducted interviews with residents and community organisations, and during these discussions, it became clear that during its industrial days, Ligoniel relied heavily on trade coming in from the inner city. But as well as the mills on site, almost every other house was converted to a shop. Every street corner had a pub, and people would create pop-up cottage industry, where some would bake fresh soda to sell to the mill workers every morning. Much of my understanding of community life in Ligoniel came from conducting these interviews, listening to the stories and tales of the people who have lived within the village of Ligoniel since the days of its mill industry. Much of my understanding of community life in Ligoniel came from conducting these interviews, listening to the stories and tales of the people who have lived within the village of Ligoniel since the days of its mill industry, and it is through these stories and conducting site visits to explore the same streets told of in these tales created such an immersive experience for myself and gave me an additional level of information that could never be found from reading a book or an article, and this in turn fostered an increasing passion for this project as I now felt my own connection to the village of Ligoniel. It seems that storytelling is heartfully valued within the community of Ligoniel. Determined to preserve and share the village and its history for future generations, the value of storytelling in general helps to inspire, and as I experienced myself, the sharing of a story can forge new connections between people and their ideas. Storytelling, especially in Ligoniel, conveys the culture, history, and values that continue to hold on to the small unity that the community has left, due to all the factors which so desperately act to divide and fragment the area. But this unity and this connection, through the stories of its communities, must be preserved. And if it is strengthened and solidified as a core value within this village, it may just be powerful enough to encourage the social engagement which Ligoniel desperately craves. As the linen industry in Belfast began to decline, business within Ligoniel would also fall. On paper, the village was thriving and continued for decades to expand and develop, but at ground level, the community of Ligoniel experienced the opposite of growth and prosperity. Already an area so disconnected from the city, with one road in and one road out, the newly developed housing which surrounded the original residential core of Ligoniel formed their own identity, and rather than identifying with coming from Ligoniel, residents identify with living in the surrounding streets of Thornbury or Mill Valley, leaving Ligoniel's core village socially segregated from its own surrounding community. These themes of segregation and fragmentation only worsen when we focus on this core of residential housing, and for context, we will first explore the important story of how this core development of Ligoniel was realised. In January 1977, a meeting was held to discuss the development proposals for Squires Hill and Ligoniel to provide more Catholic houses within the outskirts of the city. In 1977, the DOE report on potential problem areas of housing describes the greenfield site at Ligoniel as having an extremely important part to play in easing the problems of rehousing people from its Catholic redevelopment areas in Belfast, as it was the only land available within the city on which to build housing for the Roman Catholic population. However, once developed, modifications were made by the security forces to Phase 1 of the development, bordering the playing fields of a Protestant primary school, and Phase 2, bordering the private Protestant residential settlement of Squires Hill. Squires Hill residents were taking a firm line against the scheme, with very strong objections being made against the second phase, which would bring Roman Catholic houses to the edge of the Squires Hill estate. Residents were even quoted to have said if Phase 1 of the housing could be stopped some way off the primary school, then the scheme would be accepted on security grounds. The Squires Hill residents would simply tolerate the situation. The report therefore recommends a considerably reduced scheme based on taking these very real fears into consideration, together with strong advice from sources within the military and the RUC against the planned siting of the estate. A briefing note issued in September 1977 noted a continued pressure from the security forces for modification to the Squires Hill Ligoniel scheme, premised on these continued objections. In response, the Minister for Housing, Ray Carter, directed the DOE to incorporate compensatory conditions to the granted planning permission, which would consist of 1. Particularly heavy planting to a minimum depth of 12 metres in the proposed landscape strip between the two developments. 2. That a physical barrier should be erected before any of the executive houses immediately adjacent to the private development were occupied. 3. That the relevant executive houses should not face towards the private development. And 4. That there should be no access whatsoever, vehicular or pedestrian, between the two developments. The ways in which these conditions were interpreted by the designers in the realised construction of the Ligoniel development continues to profoundly impact its present relationship with the Squires Hill settlement. The detailed design of the residential arrangements contained within the approved planning permission documents meant that it was simply not possible to turn houses around so that they did not face Squires Hill in order to meet the third condition. The quality of not facing the relevant executive houses has therefore been achieved through a reversal of the social programme of the dwelling rather than physically rotating the dwellings. Front gardens have been reverse engineered as backyards, and large living room windows appear as disproportionately sized kitchen windows. The requirement for particularly heavy planting has been incorporated by way of a physically divisive zone of mature trees and assorted vegetation. This is a permanent material barrier that is not on any list of interfaces recognised by the Northern Ireland Government. As a result of these modifications to the Ligoniel housing scheme, the areas of focus resemble nothing close to the image of a traditional village. Instead, the neighbourhood exists as pockets of dwellings, broken up and separated by interfaces, roads, walls, gates, and swathes of disused land. The fragmentation runs even deeper than the neighbourhood scale, as even within these pockets, the houses are broken up into even smaller clusters, and even these clusters are broken up even further again, almost down to each individual home. All of this is due to the excessive use of walling and boundary creation within the small-scale neighbourhood. What this level of fragmentation also creates is empty, unclaimed space. And looking at each of these maps, we can clearly see the clusters of dwellings that were developed, but what we also see clearly is the emptiness which divides them. This emptiness represents what should be shared and public space if Ligoniel were a successful cul-de-sac, but instead, due to the territorial nature of how the development is laid out, this land sits unused and unclaimed by the community. Despite the continued absence of interface violence over the decades, this division has been extended in more complex and problematic forms. The most discernible of these forms is the continuation of the heavy planting zone alongside the eastern boundary of the Ligoniel development that accompanied the adjacent extension of the Squires Hill estate in 2013. Much less noticeable are the fallow playing fields bordering the southern edge of the Ligoniel development, abandoned by the education authorities to create a sterile space between the adjoining housing and the local primary school. These hidden barriers create a conclusive physical dislocation between Ligoniel and Squires Hill that effectively enacts in the present day the continuous buffer first sought by the security forces in 1977. To view Ligoniel as it sits in the present, the site was broken down into its key components, influenced by Kevin Lynch's approach to mapping the city. Immediately visible is the disused land, not utilised by the governing bodies to create more housing, and with the housing that already exists, we can see that it is connected by a small number of paths, but the majority of which lead to dead ends. We see the limited amount of shared space and amenities to serve the community, and the few amenities that do exist sit on the outskirts of the village along the main road. And the housing, as discussed previously, all developed to face inwards, sealing the fate of Ligoniel's isolation from the city. Finally identified are the landmarks of Ligoniel village. As follows, they are the Ligoniel Park Dam, the ruins of the Wolf Hill corn mill, the interface which separates Ligoniel and Squires Hill, also known as an environmental corridor, and the abandoned football pitches. What these landmarks highlight is that as a result of Ligoniel's isolation from the rest of the city, it has been allowed to develop in its own bubble and has not been subject to the same levels of desolation and deconstruction as the inner city. Ligoniel has managed to hold on to remnants of each key period of time which Northern Ireland has developed through. Northern Ireland began as vast stretches of natural beauty demonstrated within its cascading landscapes, and this time is represented in Ligoniel by the remaining Park Dam. Then, Northern Ireland began to flourish and make a worldwide name for itself as it shone throughout the Industrial Revolution through exports of linen, rope, and shipbuilding, and this period of history remains present in the form of the Wolf Hill Mill ruins. Once the production of industry within Northern Ireland began to decline, shortly after, the country found itself on the brink of civil war, and suddenly began the period of the Troubles, where its imprint upon Ligoniel remains as long as the interface structure remains on site, enclosed and concealed within the environmental corridor. All of these key points throughout the genealogy of Ligoniel have culminated in creating the Ligoniel that stands today. But unfortunately, the Ligoniel of today remains just as divided, and representing this is the abandoned football pitches that remain today. Land which could act to serve this community and bring so much benefit to its people, but its only role is to act as a buffer between the two communities due to remaining sectarian divides. The goal of this thesis is to allow Ligoniel to continue in what it has become, an archive, a neighbourhood which has acted as an archive to the entire history that Northern Ireland has developed through. This thesis will celebrate the area of Ligoniel by archiving it both physically and culturally, and allowing its community and its landscape to continue telling its story. To communicate the concept behind this proposal, inspiration was taken from the work of Rem Koolhaas on the Exodus Project, in which he designed a prison set in Cold War Berlin, which would act as a place where people would voluntarily seek refuge from the world beyond its walls. What this thesis intends is to, rather than create a place of refuge within Ligoniel, it will create a place of engagement and reflection. Represented along this grid are the four key periods of history that have been previously discussed: landscape, industry, conflict, and the present. And between these stages is the path that Ligoniel has experienced in reaching each period, and the goal is to create an intervention at each key point along this path. These interventions will consist of watchtowers, built to stand tall in the cascading landscape of Ligoniel. The rationale behind using watchtowers is a nod to the introspective nature of how Ligoniel was developed, but also to deconstruct the negative connotations which surround them as a result of the Troubles conflict. Watchtowers are no longer cause for a submissive community, but instead they will allow this community to reclaim their dominance over their own land. The first watchtower is placed and orientated to view and reflect upon the natural landscape. The second, to view and reflect upon the industrial heritage that the village is so proud of. The third, to view and reflect upon the period of conflict and violence known as the Troubles. And the final watchtower is placed and orientated to view back on all these previous towers and to reflect upon the entire journey of Ligoniel's history and heritage, and admire what the village and its community have become today. With this final view highlighting the importance and value of introspection and self-reflection in recognising the past, but opening a door to moving forward into a new chapter of your story, both at an individual and community level. To complete this thesis intervention at Ligoniel, a final building will be developed, situated within the centre of all 4 watchtowers. The chosen site for this project will be the identified landmark of the abandoned football pitches, and the concept for this final project aligns directly with the concept which developed the 4 watchtowers. The final building will follow the same visible form of the towers, but rather than protrude vertically from the landscape, this building will lie horizontally, with sections of the building buried from sight within its landscape. Above ground, this building will serve the community of Ligoniel. Housed in the top levels of the building will be the long-requested youth hub that the Ligoniel Improvement Association has fought to build for so many years. Below, at ground level, space will be created to house a marketplace for the community, where residents can come and interact. And this space will also make amenities and facilities more accessible to the community by bringing them back into the heart of the village rather than existing on the main perimeter road. Then, below all of this activity, buried on the same level as the rocks of Wolf Hill, this building will house a subterranean archive, something, as we have discussed, that Ligoniel has naturally become throughout time, as it preserves so much of its history through both its physical landscape and the stories of its community. While the watchtowers serve to highlight and celebrate this archival landscape, this subterranean archive will preserve the stories. But sunken deep within the ground, it will house the more unpleasant stories told throughout Ligoniel's history. Unpleasant, but important. An oral history of the Troubles. Oral history is such a unique preservation of history. It captures people's experiences and opinions that shape the way in which we make sense of our lives. It gives a voice to those often excluded from traditional historical records. It can record changes within the culture of a place or its community, and at their most powerful, they can explain and enrich our understanding of history and encourage empathy within the past and with one another. This archive will preserve the trials and tribulations of Northern Ireland's society, those who lived through this period of conflict, and it will create a space for others to listen, engage with, and learn from these accounts in an environment which will be dulled to all other senses apart from the sense of hearing, to encourage focus and reflection before entering back into the activity of the floor levels above. The journey throughout this building will encourage a change in perspective for all visitors who seek to understand what the depths of this building hold. A change in perspective to encourage empathy, rationality, and compassion, and a perspective in which we consciously think about where our futures as individuals and communities may lead.